All right, so we're going to start with some introductions. My name is Ian Douglas. I've been in the tech industry for quite a while, almost 26 years, including development, management, full-time software teacher where I taught API design in testing and so on. I got into software testing in 2011 or so, and it changed a lot about how I view software development. So I was really excited to share this content with everyone today. I'm a big advocate for TDD and behavior-driven development. Carson, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I'm Carson Hunter. I'm a technical enablement architect here at Postman. Been with Postman for about 8 months. Before that, I was a backend developer, and my interest in testing kind of came about. We didn't have a dedicated QA department, so we were responsible for testing our own code and got into testing with Postman and really liked it. And so now at Postman, I work with our solutions engineering team to create demos and resources for both our users and employees of Postman to make sure they're getting the most out of Postman and having a good experience.
Awesome. Thanks, Carson. All right, so for our agenda today, for the sake of today's talk, we want to first welcome all of you who identify as testers. That was a big part of how Postman got started back in the day, and so we appreciate all of you coming by. And so we needed to make some assumptions and presumptions today about everyone's skill level. So we're going to start from a place that we presume everybody knows what software testing is at a high level and why it's necessary to have confidence in the software that we build. And then based on that, that there's going to be some common understanding of terms when we talk about things like expectations and assertions. We're going to be dropping a lot of links in chat as well for resources and future learning as well. So if something's a little unclear, we will be dropping in some links later on. So for today's agenda, this is what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about what is API testing. We're going to be using the web interface for Postman. We also have a desktop client that you can download as well. We're going to talk about different kinds of testing within Postman, including unit testing, end-to-end testing, and API contract testing. There's lots of different definitions of what testing is, even sometimes within the same company. So we're going to show you what this testing is going to look like within Postman. Then we're going to get into writing some customized tests, and all of these tests are going to be written in JavaScript. And we'll get into some advanced use cases and workflows for creating some complex testing, such as API contracts and so on. And then when we wrap up, we'll be sharing a number of resources. We'll be putting all those links in the YouTube video later on as well. And then we're going to leave it open for some Q&A. So in the Q&A button that you see in Zoom, you can ask your question in there. We do have a panel of folks that are going to help answer those questions. If they don't answer right away, they may be waiting because we're going to cover that content in a moment, or they may be holding it for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Carson, do you want to take us through our learning objectives for today? Oh, sorry. So let's talk about, let's launch this poll. So we want to find out a little bit about all of you. So we're going to do a quick poll here, and we'd like to find out a little bit about everybody that's attending today. So we've got quite a few folks. So we want to kind of hear a little bit about your background. So if you can take a moment in Zoom and answer these questions for us and let us know a little bit about your background. Do you do quality testing? Are you a developer? Are you in management? Are you a student or instructor and so on? And then how much experience you have with testing and how much experience you have with Postman. So thanks. I see everybody filling those out. These are fantastic. We're going to take just a moment while everybody fills this out. And then we'll share some of the data with you so we kind of see where everybody's at. We give everybody just another moment. So a high percentage of you are quality and testing folks, somewhere around 70%. About 20% of you identify as developers, about 13 to 15% as management, 6% students, got some teachers and instructors in here. Some of you are brand new to testing, and that's great. Some of you have about 15% less than a year, 23% 1 to 3 years, and 33% of you 5 years or more in testing, and about 35% of you less than a year of use in Postman. About 24% of you have been using Postman for 1 to 3 years. So we appreciate you coming by and hanging out in our webinar today. Cool. Let's move on from there. Go ahead, Carson.
Yeah, so we have a few learning objectives for this session. We hope that by the end of the session, you'll be comfortable and able to talk about the following things. So we'll go over sending a request and inspecting the response, as well as just giving you a general overview of the Postman interface. We'll teach you how to use test snippets as well as building on top of test snippets to write your own custom test code. We'll be extracting data from one request to use it in another request, and we'll do that using variables. We'll save and run requests both with a single request, send tests in a single request, as well as send a collection of requests and tests using the collection runner. And we'll explain a few different kinds of tests that can be written in Postman, which is a good transition because Ian's going to tell you about those now.
Awesome. So let's talk about API testing. So we're going to break the session into 3 areas today, starting with unit testing and then end-to-end testing, and then finish with some API contract testing. There's lots of ways to test an API. Today's session won't have time to go through all of them. So we're going to focus on these 3 things today at kind of an introductory level. Unit testing has different meanings and ways to define the term to different people within the industry. For the sake of this workshop, we're going to define unit testing as a way to explore and test a single API endpoint and its response to make sure that we get what we expect in different circumstances. Some examples of things that we can unit test include like status codes, headers, response time, the body of the response if there is one, and maybe checking that the body contains the kind of data that we expect. End-to-end testing is a more advanced workflow, and as you might suspect from the name, it's going to test bigger processes of using the API where we may consume many portions or units of an API. In some testing groups, you might call this integration testing. For example, with the light panels that I have on the wall behind me, I can make an API call to get a list of all the identifiers for each of the panels and then isolate each one of those and set them all to an individual color. That would be an example of an end-to-end test. So with end-to-end testing, we want to write tests to make sure that every step is behaving properly before moving on to the next stage. When we get into contract testing, this is also really aptly named. It allows us to test what we call the contract of the API. And when we think about contracts in the real world, it's generally a document that different parties are agreeing upon. And it's the same thing with APIs. Developers are going to negotiate on what the behavior of the entire API should be. And we can test that our API works properly according to that contract documentation. It may feel a little bit like unit testing, but the contract itself is going to be used when checking the format of the data, and it's going to make testing a lot easier. There are some similarities to unit testing here, and we'll discuss those as we go through the session. Next up, Carson's going to show everybody how to copy the learning material for today.
Yeah, so you'll see here we've got a link that takes you to the Postman Space Camp workspace. But before we switch over to the Postman interface, I want to quickly cover some Postman terminology that we'll be using in the session. So if you're new to Postman, we talk a lot about workspaces and collections. And workspaces, Ian used this metaphor the other day. I thought it was great. A workspace is kind of like your filing cabinet. It contains, all your work. And Postman, that includes collections, APIs, mocks, and monitors. And this is where everyone comes together and collaborates on the different elements. And then a collection is kind of like a drawer or a folder in that filing cabinet. It helps you to organize your work. Maybe you're on a specific task. And a collection can be copied, within the same workspace. It can be copied over to another workspace. And I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to quickly switch to the Postman interface. So we encourage you to follow along if you want to. When you navigate to your Postman homepage, it should look like this. And we mentioned that we'll be forking the main collection that we'll be working from. And what this means, if you're not familiar, forking, you might have heard it referred to when you're working on maybe a Git repo. It just means creating a copy of a body of work and maintaining a link, to the original work. In our case, it's a collection. So you can see we have our Postman DevRel team here. Ian's picture is in there somewhere. So we're on the same Postman team, which means that we can collaborate within the same workspace. But unfortunately, we can't have all of you on our Postman team. So you'll need to create a workspace where you're able to collaborate and edit things. And so I'm going to show you how to create a workspace that you will be able to work in. So if you go to this workspaces dropdown, if you have workspaces, they'll show up here, but we're going to go and create a new workspace. And I'm going to call this Carson and Ian's library, because we're going to be working with the book API today. You can give it whatever summary you want. I'll say we're testing. You can build that out later. And I'm going to select a team workspace because Ian and I are going to be collaborating together. So we want to both be able to access whatever's in here. So we've created Carson and Ian's library workspace. And so if you still have the link that was shared in the chat, I think, or the one that was on the slide a minute ago, you can click that and that'll take you to the Postman Basecamp workspace. But maybe you're watching this later, or maybe you want an alternative way to find it. This Postman universal search bar is a great option. If we type in Basecamp, you can see we've got a few results. This 4 squares icon, you can see down at the bottom, this indicates that it is a workspace. This is Postman Basecamp, created by Postman. The globe indicates that it's public workspace. So this is probably our best bet for the one that we're looking for. So once this loads, if you've attended some other Postman Basecamp lessons, you might be familiar with some of the other topics here, but this is a great place to come and catch up on any sessions you missed, or just see what the Postman Basecamp is up to. And we're going to today be working in this Postman, an introduction for testers. So if we click on this, you'll see we have a fork icon that shows up here, or you can use the 3 dots and create a fork. And to kind of elaborate on why we want to create a fork, didn't really finish my thought earlier, but when we create a fork, that means we're not all working in the same collection here and messing each other up. It also creates a link. So when we make changes to our copy, we'll be able to maybe push it back to this original body of work if we want to incorporate our changes, or maybe the Postman Basecamp team make some changes to this collection in the future. We'll get a notification and we'll be able to pull those changes back to our copy instead of kind of cherry picking all the things that have changed. It makes that process a lot easier. So for the fork label, I'll call this library. It's good to make this something specific if you are making changes that you plan to push back into the original collection in the future. And Carson and Ian's library pops up as a workspace location, and that is the one we want to fork it into. So I'll go ahead and create the fork. And so now this is loading, and we'll see that we have our own copy of the Introduction for Testers collection. And from here, just wanted to give everyone a quick overview of the Postman interface. While this loads, you can see on the left-hand side, we have a few different tabs. We have collections, we have, oops, we'll reload that. APIs, environments. Collections is where we're going to be spending the majority of our time today. You saw in the previous workspace that if you have more collections, they'll show up here under this one. If you go into environments, this is a good thing to know for testers. We'll be defining variables to use at the collection level, but if you do have different testing environments, maybe you have a QA, a staging, a production environment, environments allow you to reuse your same collection with different variable values, and really increases your efficiency with being able to just switch out those values really quickly. So looks like the rest of our workspace is loaded. And then on the right-hand side, we have a few other icons here. We've got documentation, comments. We've got some tabs for if you've created pull requests and seeing the history. So Ian, there's a lot here. When you come to a workspace for the first time, where do you usually like to start?
That's a good question. Some people like to just jump in and start sending API requests. Some people like to read the documentation. I like to kind of check through the collection and see if there's some test code a little bit, see maybe what to expect from the API. In this case, we don't have any, so we're going to teach you how to write it today. But yeah, I would probably start with the documentation. You'll notice at the bottom of the documentation panel, there's a link that says View Complete Collection Documentation. This is something I like to open up where I just see all the documentation all in one place instead of just being in a little panel on the side. And you'll notice there's kind of a tab interface at the top where we can just get back to this documentation as we do our other work.
Awesome. Documentation, always advocate for that. It's a great way to help people get started with your collection. So if we look at the collection overview, so we've already given an overview of how to make a workspace, how to fork your collection into a new workspace, and a general overview of the Postman workspace interface. So Ian, do you want to get us started with looking into a collection?
Sure, sounds great. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking through our new book workflow, in our library reference. So we're going to start with just how to examine how to actually call a request here within the interface. So what we can see in here is that we've got all these endpoints for getting all of our books, getting a single book, adding a book, and so on. And then we've also got a folder here for kind of a new book workflow, which we're going to get into a little bit later. And so when we look at a particular request, so when I click on a request, we see a number of things here. One is that we can identify this particular request by a name, and then we can choose from this dropdown one of several HTTP methods that we use for this endpoint. In this case, we're going to use get, and today we're primarily going to be using get, post, and put. And then over here is going to be the URL that we're going to be using. Now, this text that we have inside these curly brackets, this is what we call a variable in Postman. And if I hover over it, we can see that the scope of this variable is found in the collection, and it's currently set to this URL. And so we have both an initial and a current value. The initial value is something that will synchronize on the Postman servers. Anything that you set as a current value is just going to be stored in your local storage. And so it will not synchronize any current values with your team. And so it will allow your team to kind of share these collection variable names without synchronizing whatever you want set as that current value. From here, we have a send button. There are also a lot of hotkeys inside of Postman. So you can click on the send button, or if you're on a Mac, you can hit Command Enter. If you're on a PC, you can hit Control Enter, and that'll actually send the request. And when we send that over, we see a number of bits of information down here at the bottom. We have our body that we're going to take a look at here, and then we have some tabs underneath it. And the first tab is kind of this pretty view where we see kind of color-coded JSON output. If we go over to raw, we just see the raw string text that came back as the HTTP response. And then if you were viewing like an HTML page, that would be the preview tab. The visualize is something where you can actually set up your own visualizer for as you're iterating over data, you can come up with your own visualization. Today, we're pretty much going to be hanging out on this pretty tab. We can also see the status code over here. So we see the 200 OK, and if we hover over it, it'll tell us a little more information. We also see how long the request took, as well as a breakdown of how long each step took, like the DNS, the TCP, handshake, and so on, and then how long it actually took to download the data, as well as the payload size that came back. So in this case, we've got about 6 kilobytes of data. From here, we can actually save this response if we want to save this as an example. Saving these examples, you'll notice over here, we've actually got some saved examples. When you save a response like this, it's really helpful for two main reasons. The primary one is you can work offline. You can save these responses to go back and view them later on, so you don't have to call the API over and over again. This can also be really helpful if you're worried about rate limiting. You can save that response, but it's also really helpful if you want to set up a mock server later on. That's kind of outside of the scope of today, but by saving these responses, you can go in and edit them and then set up a mock server using those responses. So as far as a recap here, we've shown you like how you can actually go and send these, how to kind of view the response that came back in our body, and looking at some of the detail that we have from here. And then for the collection variable, again, if we hover over it, we kind of see the settings. If we click on the collection up here at the top, we can actually go over to this variables tab, and this is where we actually see what these values are set to. So we can see what our initial value is going to be, as well as our current value. And then the persist button here is what is going to synchronize this data to the Postman servers if you want to collaborate with your team. Cool. So Carson, everybody's here to learn about testing. So let's go over the testing that we have in here and show them how to get started.
Yeah, let's dive into it. So if we go back into our Get All Books endpoint that Ian was just in, you can see we have a test tab up at the top. And I'll minimize our response pane a little bit. And you see that this Snippets pane pops up on the right. And this is a great way to get started writing tests where you don't even have to write a lot of code to get started. What snippets are they're kind of pre-written chunks of code where if you click one, it automatically populates it into your test pane and you're able to use it. So if we scroll through here, we see we have a lot of code around getting a variable, setting a variable, checking a response body, as well as status codes and some more specialized things. So I feel like the most common thing that you want to check when you have a GET request is that your response is okay. You're getting a 200, everything is coming back okay. So if we click that, we've got a status code is 200 tests. We'll get into the architecture of how these tests are set up here in a minute, but you can see that we have one assertion that says our response has a status of 200. And this is pretty easy to read, pretty close to how you would say it conversationally. And what is under the hood here is a JavaScript library called chai.js. And hopefully someone can paste that in the chat if you're interested in reading more about how chai works and the different options that are available. Ian, I know you're kind of our testing expert. Do you have any thoughts on how chai fits into TDD and BDD, the testing world?
Yeah, so in Postman, a lot of what we're going to be doing, because we're kind of viewing the API from the user's perspective, that's really more behavior-driven development. And so most of what we're going to be working through today is going to be the BDD, or the behavior-driven development, and not so much the TDD side of things, where we would kind of work things from the developer perspective. And so a lot of the chai keywords that we'll see in here are going to be like pm.expect to set up those assertions. There is an assert keyword if you want to get into strict TDD for building out your API, but most of what you're going to see us doing today in JavaScript is going to be behavior-driven testing.
Awesome, that's very helpful. So a couple things to note here. Once you've put in a test snippet, you are able to modify it and kind of build on top of it. So we do have one assertion here. We could have multiple assertions. You probably wouldn't want to do the same one, but just for the sake of, example, we could have two assertions here. Right now, they're asserting the same thing. And if we send this, we can see that we've got one test coming back. Status code is 200, even though we have two assertions. And right now, 1 out of 1 is passing, which is great. But you also want to know that your test fails. So I'll just show you what that looks like. We already know that our test is returning a 200. So if we say that it's returning a 200 and a 400, obviously that's not right. So if we send it, this is what that would look like if you get a failing test. You can see our assertion that our status code is 200 returns an error, which, you don't like to see it, but it's good to know that it can fail. And one other thing to note is that if you are, debugging a response, trying to figure out what data you're pulling into your test, Postman does have a console function that you can access. So if you start typing console, the predictive text always helps out here. Log, you could do console debug, and I'll just write a classic hello. If we send that, open up the console down here at the bottom left corner, you can see our hello string was returned. You can use the console logging function, inside of a test, outside of a test, wherever you have data that you want to kind of, check that it's what you expect. This is a great tool for debugging. So that's kind of a very general overview of the testing and console tab. Ian, do you want to kind of dive into how we can write some more custom tests?
Sure. And one common question that we get with the test snippets is whether you can write custom snippets. It is something that's on our roadmap, but not something that we currently have. But we do have quite a collection of these snippets over here that you can use. Cool. Well, let's get into writing some custom tests and show you some sort of common examples that you might actually use in your API testing and sort of break this down. So PM that we see here in the test code, this is our Postman object, and this kind of overlaps all of our Postman API as well as like the chai library and so on. And so we start a test by doing pm.test, and then we give it a unique string. You want to make sure that that string is actually unique from one test to another, because that's the string that you're going to see down here when the test actually runs to show you whether it passed or failed. So if you have that same string over and over again, it's not going to be very helpful. From here, then the second parameter is just going to be the function code, and this just needs to return a true or false. And that's what these pm.response assertions and expectations are going to do for us. If that function returns a true, then the test will be passing, and if it's false, then it will not be passing. The code will also stop if you have syntax errors, so it won't execute anything at all, and it'll show you on this panel that we see down here where the test is running. If I had a syntax error and we try to actually send this over, we actually see that there's a syntax error and it tells us what's going on, and so it'll kind of help you out. But as Carson mentioned, this console log is really, really helpful. You can kind of break down your response and console log out what you're finding as you go, which would be really helpful here. Let's see. You can also have many tests, as Carson mentioned. So we could come in here and we could have several other snippets, like say, we want like a successful kind of status code. In this case, maybe we're doing like a 201 or a 202. There's lots of these kinds of terms inside the chai library. This is where we're actually calling out a specific expectation in this case. So pm.expect is setting up our expectation assertion, where we pass in a value of some kind and then some sort of assertion with that. We expect it to be one of these values, or we expect it to be equal to something. So what I like to do is make sure that we get a proper sort of response here. So I'm just going to write, we expect that we got a successful response. And a couple of things that we can build in here is we can actually look at our pm.response, and we can put some expectations in here that, for example, we expect to be one of, sorry, that would actually be the test that I just had in here. Let me just put that back in. We'll just leave that one in itself. Here we go. Sorry, having problems highlighting. And then we can also do other things like pm.response to be with body, for example. This will assert that we actually got a body of content back as part of our response. And then we can also say, I expect that response body to be JSON data. So if we run this now and we send this over, in this case, we didn't see what we were expecting. And that's because for something like this, we might want a 200 or a 201. And now we got our successful response. In a typical testing scenario, though, this might be something that we would want to add to all of our endpoints. And so the handy thing with this is we can actually move this up to a collection level, which will then execute this test for every other request that we make within that collection. So I'm going to get Carson to cut this to the clipboard, and we're actually going to show you how to put this up here at a collection level. So when we click on the collection at the top, we can go up to the test block up here, and then we can paste that code in here as well. Now, it's important to note that any test code that you put at a collection level is going to execute first, and then it will actually execute the other tests for each response or each request that we have here. So if we try to run that get all books again, we see that these actually ran in a different order. If you have multiple tests in here, they're actually going to run top to bottom, and there's no way to randomize these tests. So they will always run top to bottom, and your collection tests are always going to run first. Because we moved that other test up to the collection level, we see that we got that successful response. We see that that test executed before our status code was 200 that Carson originally wrote in here as well. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers how to do multiple testing in here. We showed you kind of how to customize these tests. You can write whatever JavaScript you like in here. So if you want to do some other work, you can say, I want my data to be my pm.response, and this will actually like break this down as a JSON payload. You can write as much JavaScript in here as you want, but anything that starts with pm.test is actually going to run and execute as a test when you hit that send button. Now, anything that's in this test block is going to execute as soon as the request is over. Anything in the pre-request script is going to execute before the request happens. And so in a typical testing scenario where you might do some setup or some sort of work ahead of time where maybe you need to pre-parse some data, you can put that code inside the pre-request script. That's going to execute, and then your request is actually going to be called, and then it's going to run the test code afterward. And we're going to get into a little bit of that in a moment. So next up, Carson, why don't you show us how to add a book to our library here, and then we're going to store some information in a variable and show you how to use variables.
Yeah, so now we're going to move on to this new book workflow folder. And this kind of, emulates how you might have an API where you need to build a workflow that has multiple requests that you want to run in order. So for our library, we're going to be automating the task of adding a book to our library, getting all books to make sure that it was added, and then checking out that book that we added to our library. So if we go to this add book post request, you can see we've already got some body data filled in here to add the book Dune to our library. And this would work, completely as is, but as testers, we want to be as efficient as possible, and we don't want to repeat ourselves. And I imagine we'll be using this title Dune quite a lot if we're testing it. And so especially if this is a longer title. Luckily, Dune is a short title for a long book, but we wouldn't want to misspell it. So let's extract that to a variable so that we are able to reuse it later. So I'll copy Dune to my clipboard so we have it saved. And Ian showed the double curly brace syntax to denote a variable earlier. We'll call this book title. So we've got that saved, but we haven't told Postman what value to associate with this variable yet. So we'll do that in the pre-request script. So before we send this request, we'll tell Postman to set our book title variable to have a value of Dune. So we can go back to our snippets pane and we'll set a collection variable and we'll say set the variable book title to the value of Dune. And so that should work. And before we send this, let's go ahead and write some tests, because once we send this, we will be adding a book and we don't want to keep adding multiple of the same book if we can help it. So if we go up and look back at our reference, we can see the add book has a saved response. And if we do this successfully, we should get a message of okay. And so that might be a good thing to test, just that we're getting that okay message. So we'll go through once again back to our snippets pane. We'll say our response body JSON value check. We'll name it so that we know what we're talking about. We'll say book added successfully. I can type. And then we've got our JSON data. And I believe that was a message property. And we'll say that equals a string of okay. So we've got a pre-request script, we've got our test. Let's see how this goes. Awesome. So we've got a message of okay. Normally, I think if you had a post request and you're adding a item to a list, you might get the ID of that item returned so that you can use it later, to check that specific value. For this API, it doesn't have it, but that's fine. We've got both of our tests are passing. This is our collection level one that Ian added earlier. And then this is the test that we just added, book added successfully. So now we'll go and check that that book was added to our library by getting all books. So if we send this, we'll see that we do have Dune. We don't really know, since you all might be using this API as well, it won't always be the first one returned, but since we don't have that ID to, make sure our copy is the one that we're working with, we'll go ahead and, just get the first book and save that ID for later. Ian, do you have a recommended test snippet for this kind of situation?
Yeah, we should be able to, let's see, if we go through the snippets here, we should be able to extract a JSON value. And so this would typically be a JSON value check. But what we can use with this is we can see, did we find our book? And what we can do with our JSON data here is now we're getting an array back. And so our JSON data is going to be an array. And so we can say we expect that the first element in that array maybe has a title. And so we expect our title to equal Dune, for example. But again, we don't necessarily know that the first one that comes back is going to be Dune, especially with a number of people in the conference today. And so what we might want to do instead is just look at the raw text. And this is basically looking at all of the raw text within the response. Actually, I won't call that response, but we can just say that we expect that our pm.response.text includes the word Dune. So we'll do pm.response.text to include Dune. So we're just going to expect that our book title exists in there somewhere. Now, Carson saved the word Dune as a collection variable. And so we can also do collection variables. And again, the autocomplete is really, really helpful for this. And I can say, I expect to go get my book title. And now we can say, go get that collection variable and expect that the raw text of our response contains that title in here. So if we send this over, it should pass for us. And so this just detected that we did see Dune. And, as we mentioned, we do see some other people adding some other books in here. And so we wouldn't want to check that Dune was the first book that came back, but we do see Dune in the response somewhere.
Awesome. Yeah, and so we've made sure our book is added to the library. Let's take a peek at this next request. We see that we have a patch request, so we're going to update one of the books to check it out. And we see that we have this ID path variable, and we can see that it's unresolved. And so we need to tell Postman which ID we wanted to check for and check out. So we can do this back in this get all books test script. So after we've already sent our test, let's just get the first book that comes back and set that as our ID so that we can check it out. It might not be our book with everyone working on it, but not a huge deal. So we'll go back to our handy dandy test snippets. We'll set a collection variable. We will set that ID, which is the syntax we saw in the next request, and we'll save it to PM response.json. And like Ian was mentioning, we are getting an array back. So we'll get the first element of that array and we'll get the ID. So this will theoretically save this first object's ID value. So
now, Carson, one thing that we may want to do here is we can only grab that ID if we know that this succeeded. So we may actually want to move this line of code into our test, because if the test didn't work, we may not be able to extract this and we would end up with a JavaScript error. So we might want to move this into a test where we know that we got a successful response. So yeah, let's just add this to our test here.
Awesome. So we send this. Let's just make sure if we go to our update book, we can see that now this variable is resolved and it's got an ID value in our current value. So this is great. And if we go over to the body, we'll see that we're sending some JSON to say that we want to set the checked out property to a value of true, and that'll indicate that that book is now checked out. And so before we go ahead and check out the book, let's once again see what we're expecting to come back. So if we successfully update a book, we'll once again get a message of okay. We've got a couple error responses saved as well, worth looking at. This is returning a status of error if it's not found, or if we get an internal server error, we'll get an error as well. So let's just, again, check that this was returning a message of okay. So go ahead, back to our snippets pane once again. We'll do a JSON value check. We'll do JSON value message to equal okay. Does that look good, Ian?
I don't think we need value here because we're unpacking JSON data already, so it should just be JSON data.message. Yeah, let's try that.
Okay. Awesome. So it looks like our collection level got a successful response, and then we didn't name our test. We should do that. Checked out our book. So now if we run that again, it should be renamed. So we'll do that, just see if it works. Awesome. So now we've checked out our book, our tester names, so that we know what's going on. So we've shown you how you can pass data from one response to another using variables. We've shown how you can, check your response values to make sure you're writing your right tests. Ian, are we ready to kind of run all of these in order? Are we missing anything?
No, I think we're good, but running each of these ones manually is kind of time consuming. Is there a way that we can kind of batch these up and run them all together?
I'm so glad you asked. There is, in fact, a way to do that called collection runner. So you may have seen this in Postman before, where you can run a whole collection using this collection runner, but you can also do this for just a folder of requests. So if you only have a subset of workflow that you're working with, we can do that now for our new book workflow. So if you click on the folder and click run, you'll see that we just have our 3 requests that we're working with. And so these will hopefully run all in order and execute our workflow much faster than we could send them ourselves. So let's run this and see what we get.
Yay.
Awesome. So you can see that we've got our collection level test. It's running before each of these 3 requests, which is what we want. So we want to test them all without duplicating our code. So Ian, I think we can turn over to you to talk about the next section.
Right. So let's talk about contract testing. So this is going to make some of the testing work a little bit easier when we talk about how we test our APIs. So what we'll notice here in this bottom folder called contract testing, when we click on the JSON schema version 4 validator, in the test code here, we have a bunch of test code that's already set up. And this is using an older library called TV4, which is the tiny validator for version 4 JSON schema. Thankfully, they abbreviate it. But what you can define is a JSON schema of what you expect to come back as your payload of data. So in this case, when we call this particular schema for our getting all of our books, for example, we expect that we're going to get back a type of array. And then each item in that array we expect to be an object, and you can specify which fields are required to be there and so on. And then we can specify the fields or the attributes that we expect to come back in that API, as well as their data type. And so we have access to things like strings and numbers and Booleans. And there are ways that you can define, like this could be a string or a null. And there's lots of pattern matching and so on that you can do on these as well. And so down at the bottom here, what we have is a quick example of how we can use this TB4 library. And if we send this over, we'll see that this test passes right away because the data that we get back matches. But one thing that you may want to test in your testing is if you get a bunch of information that you weren't expecting in your JSON payload, you may want a way to be able to test that you got additional things that you didn't maybe want inside that response. And so in this case, if we kind of remove everything but the book title and the author and maybe the ID, and so we take out things like genre and so on, if we send this over, it still says that everything passed, even though we've only specified title, author, and ID as fields that we expect to get back. But in this case, we're actually getting more than that coming back. And so there is a way that we can add this to TV4. There's a third and fourth parameter that we can add in here. The first one will typically always be false, and this is basically whether the JSON payload that you have come back has sort of self-referential data, which isn't common in JSON, which is why this is typically false. And if we set a fourth parameter here to be true, this sets a strict mode on TV4 that says like, hey, throw an error if we get something back that we weren't expecting. In this case, we see now that that test failed. And if we go and look at that, then it just says like, hey, we expected that validation to pass and it did not pass. Now, it won't tell you why it didn't pass. And it's going to basically fail for each error that it finds. And so you might fix one error and then run it again and realize there's another error. So it's not going to give you an exhaustive list of errors of what happened. But you can go back and look at the body and realize like, oh, there were all these other things that were supposed to be in here. Carson, can you undo some of my changes in here to put those values back within the schema? Thank you. And once more.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And so we do have that TV4 library. Unfortunately, it hasn't been updated in a really long time. And so we're actually recommending not to use the TV4 library. And so we've got another code snippet that I'll get Carson to paste in here. And it's using a library called AJV. And we'll post a link to that in the chat as well. And one thing that we need to do here is we need to actually remove that schema line. And so for the sake of using AJV, I'm actually just going to take that out of this up here. So this was an old sort of carryover from the JSON schema where the schema itself had a URL reference of where to go validate that the schema was actually matching. So if we take that out, all of the rest of the structure stays the same. And now the AJV library, these are both built into Postman, by the way. And so you can just say, I want to require AJV as my library. You instantiate it. And then you say, I want to validate the schema that we defined up above against the response JSON that we got back from actually calling this endpoint. And if it didn't work out, we're going to log everything over to our console log. And so in this case, the strict mode is actually turned on by default. There's a lot of really great options that you can set in the constructor here when you're instantiating AJV to add all kinds of strict mode and lots of other capabilities here. And then we expect this validation to be true. So if we send this over, we see that this actually passed in strict mode. So again, if I were to come up here and actually remove the created at timestamp and we try to send this over, this should fail for us. Oh, no. I should have tested that earlier. So there are strict modes that you can enable here. I think it will give you warnings by default if like data types don't match and so on. And so again, you can use console log to debug from there. Awesome. So that was a really quick overview of contract testing, but it does make the overall like testing the structure of, did we get the right field? Is the field the right data type? It'll save you from having to manually write all of those yourself. You can manually go through and say, I expect to have a property with this name. I expect it to be a string, or I expect the array to hold so many things. You can actually define that as part of your schema and run that against a validator. And so it'll really speed up your testing here. So basically what we've covered over the last couple of sessions, we showed you some unit testing, which is just testing a single endpoint. We showed you some end-to-end testing, which was, adding a book, getting all of our books, and then grabbing an ID, and then using that ID in a subsequent request. And then we showed you some contract testing after that. I think we're good here. So let's go back to our slides, Carson, and we'll kind of recap what we went through today, and then we'll get into our question and answer period.
Yeah, so just to recap kind of what we went over, we sent a request and inspected the response. We gave you kind of a general overview of how to work with collections and variables in the Postman interface. We used test snippets as well as writing our own custom code and built on top of our test snippets. We extracted data from one request to use another. That's when we were using our collection level variables. We saved and ran requests, both at the single request level and then running them all together in the collection runner. And then we went over the different types of tests that can be written in Postman, our unit test, end-to-end, contract test, things like that. So Ian, what's coming next?
Yeah, so we actually have a public roadmap that we'd like to share. So you can go to this link. It's go.postman.io /public roadmap. And this is basically going to show you all the stuff that the Postman team is working on. So a couple of things here that we've actually just kind of released. So you're kind of hearing it first. You can import GraphQL schemas now via URL. We're also working towards doing pull requests for environments. Again, having these different environments is really, really helpful for QA and testing. And then we're also moving our flows, which is our no-code option, into public workspaces soon. So yeah, you can go check out our public roadmap and see some of the other stuff that we have coming up. And then for additional resources, we'll drop these links in the channel or in the Zoom chat as well. The Postman Space Camp, we have the next couple of sessions already planned out. And so next month, we have getting started with Open API in Postman. And then we're going to be starting on a new series called the API Lifecycle. And part 1 is going to be building and testing an API inside of Postman. I'm going to be teaching that one in May. So if you want to come back, we do encourage you to register ahead of time for these. And then part 2 is going to be about monitoring and deploying that API. And so we've got some really great instructors kind of lined up to help through that. The next one is an intro to writing tests. And this is our documentation page on how to get into more testing. And then, of course, we have our community forum. And so if we don't get to your question today in the Q&A, we do encourage you to go check out our community forum. And there's some really fantastic folks in our community that love to help others learn about Postman. And so they can definitely help with answering your questions there. And then the last link that we have here is the whole workspace, just about diving in even deeper on testing. Today was meant to be kind of an introduction to this, but if you want to get into some deeper examples, you can go check out that workspace and fork those collections as well. All right, so we're going to take some time for some questions. We do have a couple of questions from the team that they've kind of queued up for us. And so we're going to take a look at some of these. And again, if we don't answer your question, we will encourage you, please drop by our community forum. We also have a link that you'll see here as well. We're going to drop that in chat for a feedback survey. We do take feedback from these sessions very seriously. We use them to iterate and improve ourselves and our presentations and the content that we provide to everybody. So please take some time to fill out the survey for us. So the first question we had from an anonymous user, sending responses and collections is very useful, but in some situations, I want to send the exact request URL and body with the exact response headers and body that I received during the testing to the developer for debug assistance. This is especially useful in situations where they were able to recreate the specific error that I was receiving. Is there a way to send the response aside from the awkward formatting that comes from copying and pasting? So there is an interceptor proxy that you can use to kind of catch that entire request inside of Postman. And then you can find that request in the network tool within your browser. And then you can export that as HAR. And then you can import that later on into Postman. There are some resources that you can go check out on our YouTube channel and the Learning Center as well, if you want to get into that in a little more detail. Next, we had a question from Hamal. If we have test code in the pre-request and test tab, if we're exporting the request as C# code, how can we export the code as C# in the pre-request and test tabs? So right now, the code snippets don't export those. We don't have a way to really export that code as other languages, because all the testing code that's running inside of Postman is going to be in JavaScript. So we don't have a way to replicate that in other languages. It's a great idea, though. If you want to send that in as a feature request, maybe the team can take a look at that. The next question we had, yep. Go ahead, Carson, if you want to take that one.
Sure. So Kamraj asks, how am I supposed to save responses of all of my collections after my tests? And there is an option in the collection runner to automatically save all of your responses, which might be worth checking out. And then the next one from Ernan, sometimes I'm getting a 201 instead of a 200 response. Is it about a Postman config or something else? Ian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, typically that response is going to be coming from the server itself. And so I would check with your development team. If it was something that you saw in our endpoint today, then we can definitely take a look at that. But that's going to be coming from the server. So that's not going to be Postman specific. That's actually coming from the URL that you're hitting. And so I would check with your team on that. Typically a 200 is kind of like a generic, okay, like I got your request and I handled it properly. A 201 status code generally indicates that something was successfully created on the server side, and you would typically see that with a post request or with a put or patch. And so if you're doing a get and you're getting a 201 back as a response, that's kind of to me, it feels like a bit of a mismatch. And so I would check with your team on that to kind of isolate what might be going on. It might be a combination of the parameters that you're sending and so on.
And then another question from Renan, based on your experience or project that you've done, what's a good practice in using global variables versus environment variables? For me, I like to use global variables when a value is static and it's not really going to change between your environments. An environment might be you're switching between a production environment, staging, QA. Sometimes I like to store, if I have like credentials that are being used across all of those three, I'll store that in a global one so you don't have to copy it between all of your different environments. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, could we go back and share Postman real quick and we can show them maybe how to do that in the environment?
For sure.
So what we noticed is that we actually had the URL in a collection variable up here for that base URL. So if we come back to our collection and we look at our variables, we have the base URL at a collection level. This URL might be something that you want to set at an environment level. So we can come in here and we can actually create an environment called development and an environment called QA and an environment called staging. And then up here in the top right corner, this is where you would choose that environment. And then when you run your collection runner or run an individual test, it's going to use whichever environment you pick. And so it might actually be a good idea to move this into more of an environment variable as opposed to like a collection variable or a global variable. And then with a global variable, it really comes down to scoping. Like Carson mentioned, like the global variable is going to be available to the entire workspace. It can be handy for things that aren't going to change based on your environment. So if you know that you're always going to paginate and expect 10 items, that might be more of a global sort of variable that you would want to set. Where something like a URL, I might want to set that at more of an environment variable. So if I change my environment up here from QA to staging, and I go and run all my tests, it's going to use a different URL there instead.
Awesome. We've got another question that might be good to demo. Can you show us how to do a variable from one response of one endpoint and use the variable in a test for another endpoint? For example, we post a user, and in the response, we get created with the user ID, and we can assign the ID to a variable. And in the delete endpoint, we can use this variable to pass it for deleting.
Yep. And so we did kind of show that that workflow a little bit by adding a book, getting all the books, getting that ID, and then updating that book based on that ID. And so we did kind of show an example of that. If you did want to go through and actually delete that as part of your ID, what we noticed here in the params section is that we're actually using a path parameter here. And so in Postman, we can use parameters using the curly brace, which will come from a collection, a global, or an environment. But anything in a URL that starts with a colon, like we see here with colon ID, is actually going to come as a path variable. And again, we can extract this from a collection variable or a global variable or an environment variable as well, depending on where you're storing it. In this case, we could also just make a local variable. There's some code that we could write called pm.variables, which just makes kind of like a temporary scoped variable for that response. But for something where you're going to be doing it in between responses or like in between requests, I would probably store that at a collection level.
Awesome. That looks like the end of our curated list of questions, and we're about at time. I'll go back to our slides. Let's see.
So again, if we didn't get to your question today, please feel free to drop those in our community forum, and we'll try to address those in the forum. And there are other community members that would love to help you out as well, but our team hangs out there as well, and we'd love to answer those questions. But please do take some time to fill in this feedback survey for us as well. And I think that was it. Yep, that was all we had for today. So thanks for attending. We appreciate everybody's time today. Thanks for dropping by. We hope this was helpful. Again, we're looking forward to going over that survey feedback, and we'll see you next month for our next Postman Space Camp. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.